All right. Well, we don't have our whole committee. Hopefully, a few folks make their way in as we're going, or are able to get feedback afterwards. I wanted to say a couple things in the very beginning. One, this is our last um, committee meeting. It's sad. I know we will still get together as a group for the recommendation to council. But in terms of just getting this group together, it is still our last meeting for that. Uh, I do have a slide a little bit later that gets into, for obvious reasons, why that's important and what we need to get out of this meeting. And so I'll cover that in a little bit. Apologize that I'm not able to be there in person. I'm down in Tacoma at the American Planning Association conference. So um, apologies for that, but we will push on anyway. Um, a couple of things. I'm going to share my screen here in a little bit. We did get feedback um, from a few committee members on different things, so that's been incorporated into the presentation. We do have that information, so like Josh, I know you sent some things. If at some point you want us to pull something up to reference, we have that and can pull it up as well. If you want to just speak to it, that's probably easier too. But we can do those different things. So happy to pull those things up as folks sent them, and hopefully we didn't miss anything. But if we did, somebody please speak up and let me know. I'm also not going to be able to know if uh, like folks are raising their hand on the phone or they want to speak. So I'm hopeful that folks in the room can just kind of uh, help to facilitate conversation a little bit and see if someone's got their hand raised or wants to talk. So with that, I will go into our presentation and we'll kind of kick off what we're talking about for today. And I will go share screen. And hopefully we're good. Y'all can let me know if that works.
Yep, we can
It's
see the
good.
screen.
Perfect. So wanted to talk a little bit about the open house. We do have kind of a summary of key takeaways from both the open house and from the survey. There was a lot more response to the survey than there was written response in the open house, but I know a lot of you were having conversations during that, so I do want to hear some of those things as well. We're going to talk about like final council recommendations. This is really, and I have a slide a little bit later. This is the really important thing. Like when we leave this meeting, we need to know that we have the committee's full guidance and to some extent, to most of the extent, agreement on these different questions that we have throughout this presentation. So there's kind of two main points in this presentation where I'm going to stop. I'm going to put some questions out there that are questions that are still outstanding for us, and that's where we really want the committee to provide feedback. You're welcome to obviously, talk and ask a question or anything as we go, but it's going to work best if we get to those kind of stopping points because I think those are going to be most of the discussion. And if there's further discussion that comes off of that, that's perfect. We can keep going with that. So I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to give feedback. But I also, there's a few like informational points that I want to get through before we launch into the main kind of discussion portion. And with that, we'll talk about next steps for what happens after this, after our last meeting. So I want to talk a little bit about the open house, and this is one of the points where I do want to kind of open it up to the group. We did hear a couple things. So about 40 to 50 attendees. It was kind of hard to tell with committee members there, and folks didn't all sign in, and so a little difficult. But I thought in general it was a good number of people who came out. There was a good array of opinions expressed, I'll say. Pretty minimal feedback on the actual boards, but that was okay because I think people were having a lot of good discussions. At least in the conversations that we had, fairly even split or so in terms of in favor or in opposition of step housing. I don't always like to characterize everything as in favor of or opposed to, because I know most people don't fall like on either extreme; they fall somewhere in the middle. But I will say in the conversations that the intent of saying that is it was a fairly balanced discussion with a lot of the folks that I talked to. Most people were seeking to learn about step housing, and so I took away the other slide. So I want to hear from this group a little bit, the conversations that you had, and also your thoughts on one of the things that we talked about earlier was just broader discussion of step housing, more community outreach by the city. That could be a potential thing in the future that could happen, not necessarily tied to a project, but in advance of projects coming out, so the community is more familiar. I mean, how do you think that format worked for that? Is there something in the future that could work better? Open up to the group on any of those kind of questions and your thoughts on those. So I guess maybe just start with maybe some of the conversations you all had. I mean, how do you think it was? Do you think you got some good feedback? Did you hear something that's worth the rest of the group maybe hearing?
I mean, I can go a little bit because this is
Yeah.
in some of the feedback I sent you, but I mean, in general, I would say most of the people that I talked to, have listened to, seems like it was present in portions of the feedback, just looking at your recap that you emailed out too, is kind of a lack of clarity that when we talk about step housing, there's actually four different models that sit underneath kind of the acronym, right?
Hmm.
And I would say 100% of the negative feedback that I got was specific to PS, to permanent supportive housing, not to the other three models. All of the comments that I got that were in opposition, not that I didn't hear stuff that was in favor of it too, right? But they were all very specific to permanent supportive housing and obviously specifically to the Plymouth project itself. Um, that plus kind of kind of your recap leads me to believe that while, I mean, I'd be interested to see the survey of opposed versus for or whatever, right? That kind of, the city in general is not quite there on permanent supportive housing, but is there on step. And I think, people did point out some of the other models, whether it was Lake City Partners and previously Mary's House and kind of Imagine Housing, some of those other organizations, right, that have come into the city with little or no opposition, are operating, in a successful fashion, that sort of a thing. And so, I mean, one of the things I would like to see here is actually a recommendation that we try to prioritize the first three models kind of initially. You obviously PSH has to be part of the final recommendation
Right.
here, but I think it's pretty clear that, there's very minimal opposition to the first three models, and most of the debate is around PSH.
I mean, that's really good. That is good to hear. I did read your feedback that you sent over providing that. It's a good point you make that, right? That because of state law, I mean, it's not that like we can exclude permanent supportive housing. So that discussion is off the table. But when we get into the discussion point, let's bring that back up because that is one of the questions that I want to get to when we have the discussion portion of this. So that's good that I'm glad you brought it up right now. Um, anyone else thoughts on just general feedback that you heard?
I reached out to several people I knew who have maybe previously they're residents of Kenmore or they work in Kenmore and they're previously lived at Mary's Place or lived in PSH with a family member that they separated from or different situations. And none of them said that they felt comfortable coming to our open house because they were not comfortable with how their neighbors showed up at previous city council meetings. And so they filled out the surveys, but I asked maybe 10 people. I was like, this impacts you, this impacts your families, we want your feedback. And I got very harsh, no way in hell. I've heard what my neighbors think about vulnerable housing. I've heard what my neighbors think of STEP. I like that my neighbors don't know this impacts me. I'm not showing up in the same room as them. You can send me an anonymous survey, but I'm not showing up there again. So I think that's also really valuable feedback that I think we had a pretty strong selection bias of who showed up. No, I was there and I saw a lot of the same familiar faces that I often see at these events, which is nice. But also, who did we not see in the room?
A
Yeah.
great point. And not unfortunately for any planning process, not just STEP, it's not uncommon that we see the same people attending most meetings over and over again. It's we try and get different ways out, and that's why we provide anonymous surveys and those types of things as well. But it is good feedback to think about going forward, especially when we're having discussions on topics that are not that can be controversial, that people can be feel really strongly about. We need to provide some method for people to be able to provide feedback who don't feel comfortable. But also, I mean, there's a difference between attending in person and attending and filling out a survey online, you do miss out on some of the discussion portion. And
Yeah.
so what is a way, and we're not going to solve this today, but what is a way that city can think about having further discussions, in-person discussions and virtual ones as well, but in person where maybe there's a way to create a level of comfort so we can get a broader cross selection. Because I would wager to say most folks probably want to have everyone in the room, and it's not anyone's intention to, regardless of how they feel, not anyone's intention to say, oh, I want my position to exclude someone else from coming. Uh, but I can understand how someone would feel that way. So that's great feedback. Thank you. Anyone else want to give any feedback on what you all heard, or on the meeting format in general? Just
I spent a lot of time providing general education about STEP and dispelling some seriously interesting conspiracy theories. Not that it's funny, but it was kind of funny. I probably spent 10 minutes talking with a couple of folks about the fact that the open house itself was not some secret way to slip in something for Plymouth. There is an
mhm,
extraordinary amount of sensitivity, and I'm going to call it flat out paranoia that the city is colluding with Plymouth. Still, again, whatever, however, people are very extraordinarily sensitive to that. And I mean, it wasn't like I was talking with only folks I didn't know. I was talking with folks I did know, and they know me, and they were like, well, no, I know that the city is talking with Plymouth. And I'm like, this, no, this is not about Plymouth. And there were rumors that the city was going to do something with the waterfront where Kenmore Air is and make it into a shelter. I mean, there were some wild, really fascinating rumors that were dispelled as quickly as they were coming out of their mouth, and I still don't think they believe me. I mean, I think people still walked away feeling like, okay, I've checked the box and I've gone because the city's checked the box and they've done this little thing and now they're just gonna do what they're gonna do. There was a bit of a cynical edge to it that I thought was interesting and very kind of leaning towards how do we keep this out, despite the fact that it's very clear there's not a choice here. Step is coming, it needs to come. And when it got down to it, even folks, there was one gentleman who it sounded like he was interested in opening potentially an adult family home or some type of a smaller multi-family type housing
mhm,
piece. And he was upset about the fact that the public interaction for the different levels of projects, like the public notifications, those levels were different. And he was requesting, and so I said I would bring it back and let you all know that the amount of interaction, public notification for the largest projects should be the same as all the way down the board. Same for the smallest projects. And I tried to ask, well, so if we were to go back and say, you have your small project that you're interested in, of 4 to 5 rooms with 4 to 5 folks, you feel that that should have the same amount of permitting and kind of public engagement as a larger project of, say, 30 to 40 to 50 units. And he was very clear to say yes, despite the fact that that would cause potentially serious barrier for paperwork and
It
all
costs money.
things. Correct.
Like those,
Well,
that's
money, time, I mean, it was just, it was incredible. And he was very clear to say, yes, absolutely. And there was another gentleman standing next to him who was like, absolutely, every project should have to go through the same level of scrutiny, no matter the size. And so I don't know what can be done to help clarify or explain for folks kind of it felt like you're getting into the weeds in areas that I'm not at all qualified to discuss with them. But they had very big feelings around, again, for them, it came back to feeling like there had been zero effort around Plymouth and they had been hoodwinked and they were still angry and upset and they didn't want that to happen again, even if it meant that other projects would have to kind of pay the price. like the baby was about to go out with the bathwater and they really didn't care. I was blown away by it, actually. Their opposition and just their very clear message. It was like, I gotcha, I hear you. It was a bit stunning. I didn't expect that.
And sorry, you said this was from someone who was wanted to actually open a home himself?
Yep, yep.
Yeah. I mean,
And
So
I
this
correct.
person was okay with having, and in fact wanted those extra uh,
Yep.
requirements. Okay,
That
interesting.
was the message I got, and I think, Jeff, one of your folks was also standing there and we were trying to clarify and ask some questions, and it was very clear that they were not budging on that because it was trying to explain that that might not be in their best interest for a smaller project. It was almost like I was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and again, I'm conspiring, so they're not gonna believe anything I say, and they wanted very clearly the same level of scrutiny and public notification requirements and all the things, no matter the size of the project. That was the feedback. And so I told them I would bring it back. So I have done so.
Well, thank you for
I mean,
sharing.
when we get to the zone,
I was blown away. I was like, okay, that, okay.
Yeah,
I do think given the scar on transparency, when we get to the zoning and is this type one, type two, et cetera, like we definitely need to look at that because
and
if that stays as no public notice, that will not be well received by many.
it is one of the questions that we have up there, and later, a little bit later in the presentation as well. So we'll make sure that we circle back to that one. Uh,
I
awesome.
think,
Well, oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was gonna say, piggybacking a few, I feel like one of the themes I got is people's concern of, was this really only an informational meeting?
Yeah.
Or was there a project attached to it?
Yeah.
And were we sure there wasn't a project attached to it?
Yeah, I clarified that multiple times as well.
So yeah, I would say that that was the other. So.
Yeah, it is. Um, it's unfortunate, but it's a reality, right? Like the city, like there have been, we'll take Plymouth as the main example, that people have built up this kind of distrust, and it's something that we have to continue to work through. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen over one meeting to say, okay, everyone's going to just fully, get on board and be excited about this. You all saw in the comments that were provided on the survey that we sent out. I mean, there are a lot of feelings, both, in all different ways, and some of them are feelings of distrust of like, hey, I'm not sure that I understand what's going on, and I'm not sure that I like what's going on. And so, uh, there's not a whole lot this committee can do, right? Like the city is doing, I think, great work in starting to build those blocks of trust by creating uh, meetings and procedures and development standards around these different types of housing. And with that comes more transparency. With that comes more, meetings and discussions and council discussions and that kind of stuff. But it's going to take some time. And honestly, it's probably going to take some projects coming through for people to get familiar with these different types, because it's always going to be this big unknown the more we talk about it, but it's not tied to a project. So it, you're right. Like this particular process is not tied to a project, and maybe the next outreach meeting is not tied to a project. But at some point, right, the goal is, and whenever you put development standards in place, is you're meeting the requirements of state law, and also that someone's going to use those development standards to do something. So at some point, right, this is going to result. And the hope is that it's going to result in some sort of housing that the community can be in favor of, and that can help a lot of people. So, okay, cool. Well, let's talk a little bit. Just we kind of covered a lot of them, but this is what we pulled out of the summary. You all got the list of every comment that we got on the survey, but a few things I wanted to highlight. So and again, I pay a little bit less attention to the support for and concern and opposition. I just had to have some way to characterize. Support for, there was a lot of support for streamlining and simplifying the approval process. Essentially, someone said basically, let's make it as easy as possible. Like I want to make sure these projects can go through, and to the point that was made earlier, maybe we look at this based on project size, because the resources that someone who's doing a 200 unit project has far outweigh the resources that someone who wants to convert a single family house or do something, will have. So they're not the same scale. We don't treat those projects that aren't step housing the same way. So it's just trying to make sure that there's some level of review on that. Resources for the community and resident safety was a big thing. Someone put, I think I rephrased it. The way their actual comment was like a post-mortem on Plymouth, to say like, hey, let's figure out our lessons learned from what happened with Plymouth and try and move on from that and learn from that. I want to see step housing types permitted more freely throughout the city. This was something, and again, the map that we've shown, right, is the areas that state law says you are required to have these different housing types. Someone wanted to basically, not someone, multiple people wanted to see it basically allowed anywhere throughout the city, all different zones everywhere. That's not currently how it's proposed. You'll see in the next couple of slides, the slide you've seen before of the different zones where the different housing types are proposed. And again, that's consistent with state law, and it does cover a good majority of the city. I think the one thing that people highlighted continuously was that it focuses permanent supportive housing specifically around the highway and kind of around the downtown area versus going further out to the city extents. So that was a comment that was made. And then convert existing housing to step housing. It's an interesting thought, right? Conversion, I think it'd be interesting to, it's really the same process. It will probably be the same process that we establish here for permitting, and building permit might be different in terms of new development versus a conversion, but that would follow the city is basically the same existing process that they have. So on the concern side, there was concern around safety and security of residents. There was a lot of mention of concerns about drug use, and I'm bringing that into downtown. Overcrowding capacity. This seemed to be, and again, I'm trying to interpret written comments. So it seemed to be around traffic concerns, around people bringing more people into the city, regardless of whether it was step housing. It was concern around there just being more people, more cars, more everything in the downtown area. We'll talk a little bit about this when we get to the agreements portion, but there was a want and need to enforce in the agreements and rules. Again, we'll cover it in a little bit. There was a number of people who felt like even if we have these agreements in place, how enforceable are they? Josh, I know you made some comments on that as well. And to that extent, even if they are enforceable, like how much are people actually going to pay attention to them? So we can have a discussion about that a little bit later as well, in terms of how do we maybe make these useful documents as part of this process. Negative impacts to property values. A lot of people mentioned they thought Kenmore was too small for this type of housing, which is an interesting comment because obviously every jurisdiction, regardless of size, is subject to this, and there are many jurisdictions that are much smaller than 25,000 people. So it's an interesting thing, but it's again, it's a perception thing. And then there was a comment that I thought was really interesting. It wasn't to say the city is not doing this, but it was saying, remember to recognize the sentiment of the community who opposes this. There was someone who wrote in a comment that don't just, like, for all of us who maybe aren't on board with this, who oppose this, don't just call us NIMBYs and disregard our opinion. Like, there's a lot of the community that feels this way. Make sure that's taken into account. And so it was an interesting comment, right? Because it wasn't saying, I don't want this, but it was someone saying, I feel like when I try and engage in this process, and again, interpretation of mine, but I feel like when I try and engage in this process in the past, sometimes my voice has been kind of drowned out by, people telling me that I'm a NIMBY and I don't want to do this. So like, it's a feeling that somebody has. And so I want to make sure we relate it to this group as well. So it's in a couple of the comments that you'll see there. On the agreements, support for the agreements keeping all parties safe. So that was keeping residents of step housing safe, keeping surrounding properties safe, surrounding business owners, all of the above. There was concern that these agreements are overly restrictive. And again, I always point back to like specific comments that highlight a point. Multiple people made this point that they were overly restrictive. One person said, if I want to want to sit in my apartment and have a drink, I can do that. These folks should be able to do that too. And so, to the extent that these agreements have restrictions on alcohol use and legal drug use and that kind of stuff, it was interesting to read the comments how people felt about what the agreements should and shouldn't have in them. One person quote, we should require these of all housing projects, regardless of step housing. Like there should be part of renter agreements for multifamily projects, for, market rate projects, all this kind of stuff. Like these types of agreements should exist, which I thought was interesting. Another grouping of people said, let's keep these agreements simple. Like there was a overall desire to not see this process be so overly burdensome that it just became unrealistic. And then support for agreements with community engagement and outreach. And that's where my comment earlier was coming from of, as the city looks to continue to potentially provide information regardless of the format, if it's an in-person meeting, if it's just a flyer, if whatever it might be, there was a lot of support for continuing a discussion about step housing. So on the concern and opposition side, potential impacts to neighboring businesses, lack of enforcement and accountability, basically saying these agreements don't work. And it was, this is right, we provided information to the community. You all actually saw the draft agreements. The community did not see the draft agreements. So this was them speaking broadly about these agreements don't work because no one takes the time to enforce them and hold people accountable. It's too much work. It's not realistic. So we can talk about that back and forth about whether we think that's true or not. But and then should be more specific relating to drug use and how enforcement works. There was a lot of comments about essentially what should be mandated and what should be regulated and what shouldn't be, and wanting to see more regulation on drug use and to some extent seeing systems set in place for 1 strike, 2 strikes, 3 strikes, those types of things. There were comments about that as well. So like I said in the beginning, there was a lot of comments all over regarding both the agreement and just step housing in general. I know it doesn't necessarily make this committee's job any easier when trying to figure out how do we make a final recommendation, but I think it's important to hear. I do, if you haven't had a chance to go through and read all the comments, I do recommend you take a look through and just leaf through them, because even as I put in the summary, we cover the highlights in the summary. They weren't in any particular order of importance. They also didn't reflect how many times somebody made those particular comments. So it's kind of, I always want to make sure I qualify that and make sure that I'm not maybe giving the same level of importance to something that was a comment 1 person made versus a comment 10 people made. And the only way to really see that is to go through the responses. So a couple of things here. We'll get into council final recommendations. This is where I want to spend most of our time talking. There's a few things. This is the main charge of the committee. Like this is the reason the committee came together, is to make this recommendation to council. So it is one of the most important things we're going to do. I don't really have a thought that this group is going to need this discussion in terms of the next couple bullet points, but I always put them up here. So just be respectful of others. I can't see everyone who's in the room. So if you want to raise your hand and speak, please don't speak over other fellow committee members. If you don't agree with what they're saying, I give them a chance to speak, and then likewise they'll give you a chance to speak as well. We have a smaller group, so the keep comments as concise as possible portion may not apply as much, but still it's a comment of like, hey, we want to make sure. I have a feeling just discussion wise we may end up going longer than our time, but I don't want to make sure we go too far over to respect everyone's time. So and then the biggest thing is this last bullet point, which is we need to leave this meeting with pretty clear direction from the committee on what we want to take to city council. And so I actually think because we don't have the full group here, and because we aren't going to council until November 17th, which Debbie, just want to confirm that's still our date for when this goes to council, right?
Yes, that's the date.
Okay. So because we have a little time, right, I think I want to take this feedback, and I also want to get an email out to the group and get written comments from the folks who aren't able to attend. And we can send this recording as well, so they're able to see the discussion that this group had. That way we just make sure we're covering our bases and we get feedback from everyone. So yeah, I want to be able to get that feedback in as well, and then potentially even send revised materials back out to this group before then, to be able to just get your last feedback, written feedback on comments and things like that. So just because we're not going to meet again, I don't want you all to think this is the last time to be able to provide comments. So with that, again, the couple of things that we sent out all the materials, the actual in-text code changes, which basically were the following definitions: good neighbor agreement, emergency shelter, emergency housing, permanent supportive housing, step housing, transitional housing. Didn't see really too many comments on changing those. Those definitions are fairly straightforward. They either follow state guidance or they're similar to what many other jurisdictions have. But if there are any thoughts on those definitions, I wanted to potentially change those definitions. We'd love to hear those. And again, I have one or two more slides before we get to the discussion one. Proposed code edits. I think everyone who was able to make the last couple of meetings has seen this slide before. Adding transitional housing, permanent supportive housing in the zones you see listed, and then adding emergency housing in the zones you see listed separately there. There's different state requirements for basically transitional and permanent supportive, and then different for emergency, and then different for emergency shelters. So they're all listed here. Again, this follows state guidance, and this is what so far our approach has been. The comment that Josh brought up earlier on process, right? This is something that came up in the previous meeting, and it was on the boards that we put in the open house. Currently, City of Kenmore has a process where most projects are type 2, but they can fall under a type 1 process, subject to number of findings, and that does lessen, right? That essentially the city's most streamlined process. It does, I think Debbie can confirm, it removes the requirement for a public meeting, and it lessens the notification requirements and those things. And then, right, the intent is that affordable housing is hard to build. It's difficult, and so this is a way to incentivize it, make it a little bit easier. It's an existing process the city has. In many ways, affordable housing and step housing have commonalities. So, there seemed to be a line of reasoning that said that it could fall under the same process. I definitely want this group to talk about that and see whether that is the right approach to take. And so as we go through this next set of questions, we can go through. And then just another comment of the city is continuing to kind of interlace this with how the updates the requirements for indoor and outdoor temporary homeless shelters and cold weather low barrier shelters. So we're continuing to coordinate those efforts because there is overlap to those. So here's where I have discussion topics, and here's where I want to spend the majority of our time talking. And I've posed a couple, or I keep saying Sam's on this call as well. We've posed a couple of questions here to you all just as discussion questions, and really these are the ones that we want to make sure we get answers to because they're the biggest potential changes that could occur between now and our city council meeting. So I'll just start off with if there are any definition changes or additions that anyone would like to make to the proposed definitions that were sent ahead of the meeting. Either feel free to talk about them now or send them ahead of time or send them later on in a response. Josh, you came off mute.
Yeah, I mean, I think I sent you one comment on the definition of PSH because I don't have the exact wording in front of me at the second, but there's basically a mention that it's likely that most of these people have a criminal history. Am I right with that?
Let me see.
That's a broad statement.
This is where, well, so let me just clarify,
Yeah,
Josh. You're saying that
that's actually like the way it's written in the definition that we have right now, it specifically says
let me
likely
see,
these
since
people have a criminal history,
I
something.
have all of the materials up somewhere. Okay, here's the code of dates. Permanent. No, my computer's lagging a lot.
I mean, HUD already has some criminal history guidelines.
Yes, actually
Okay,
would.
so here's the
Yeah.
definition. Um,
Where is it?
I don't. Oh, here we go, right here. Especially So okay, let me back up a little bit. Designed to lose low barrier to entry, then would be typical for other subsidized rents. The rental history, criminal history, or personal behaviors. Is this the portion you're referencing?
Yeah, yeah. So my question here is, I think the intent of this language is to talk about people who have a history of low-level crimes likely related to the situation that they're in, right?
Yeah, it's
However,
almost like it's clarification language
yeah,
versus actually.
like the
Um,
broad interpretation, what I'm specifically concerned about there is the broad interpretation of that language would be any sort of violent crime, sexual crime, etc., theoretically would qualify under this definition. And should we either modify this to be have history of low-level crime or excludes violent or sexual crime? I mean, my hope would be the operators would do that themselves, but just the way this is written is very broad.
I guess I would be curious to hear what the group thinks. The
So
first portion, go ahead. Sorry.
I feel like, I understand that concern, and having worked with this population specifically for years, my concern with trying to not, trying to lessen it, shrink it, make it a little bit more specific, is that it then becomes exclusionary. So for example, I worked with a permanent supportive housing program that worked specifically with seniors who were 60 and older. In that program, had two people who were convicted of homicide. Those homicides were done when they were way, way younger. And they suffered from mental illness, they suffered from homelessness. I mean, it was a huge thing for them to be able to get into housing, because for other supportive housing programs, it was a barrier. And they certainly did need the program support to get into housing and to keep them safe and to provide stability and support. So I think, again, while it's broad, it's one of those things that whether we broaden things or limit things, we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we're not just talking about a single slice in time or a single program. Because again, there's some things like homicide where it is a lifelong thing that's going to follow someone their entire life. But what happens when someone is 17, for that to keep them out of housing when they're 70 feels concerning to me, to say the least. There are specific ways that we might be able to address things like sexual crimes or meth manufacturing and arson, which are three huge issues for HUD historically. I don't know if they still are, but they used to be.
Before this year, they definitely were. That is a lot going on.
Isn't that the truth?
So,
I mean,
before this year, those
those-
were really hard lines for HUD.
Those three categories, arson, sex crimes, and meth manufacturing, have always been hard nosed for this category of housing.
Yeah.
They are specific programmed different housing that it's not included in this. So I think that's just something to be really mindful of, because I think there are exceptions. I mean, it's not to say, I understand your concern 100%, and I think the people that we're actually trying to help could be adversely affected by unintended consequences if we are not cognizant of what that looks like.
Which, to piggyback off that, I think that that's why oftentimes the developer has language of you can't be convicted of some things in the last 20 years.
Correct.
Which is, it was like, okay, we're talking about seniors here,
Yep.
maybe some of their,
Should we just put that in our definition? I mean, I love the idea of like, hey, you haven't done this in 20 years. And I mean, it's a great use case you just gave there. Right.
What do we
Because
think?
if one of the primary concerns from people is safety, they're going to take the broadest interpretation of this language, right? And then you'll have people sitting there saying, you can move 50 murderers into my neighborhood.
I think that to me gets into legal areas that I don't know the answer to, because part of me says, yeah, put that in there. But then if HUD, for instance, has a hand in
Yep.
doing some things, and HUD is more restrictive or less restricted than we are, then there's a competing issue legally about things, and I don't know how that works.
I don't know. how
That's
those-
beyond my knowledge base.
I'm not a lawyer either, right? That's why I'm just like,
So, but I don't disagree with that. I wonder if there's a way to, I don't know, point something and kick it down the road into some type of, I don't know, process later specific to the project. Because again, I think that if you are looking at a project, say for Gossip Place, which deals with young adults ages 18 to 27 versus Ernest C. Anderson Place, which is 60 and above, you're gonna have very different needs for those populations, but they are both considered PSH.
Yeah. I feel like these are, to echo what you said, I feel like these are criteria that city staff or city council use when looking at developers that want to develop in Kenmore, right? Like, you know, because if you've ever been on the housing side of it and you're trying to, you know that oftentimes different developers say, okay, you can't have an eviction in the last 1 year versus 5 year versus 10 years. And different developers have their own internal metrics of how selective they are about different behaviors and different risks. And so if we as a city want to have different prioritizations of, we only want to partner with developers that are maybe very forgiving or very structured on some things, or we really only want to house old people, but we can't say that. But you know, like, I don't know. I feel like I don't know how you articulate that well, but I feel like these are things to kind of have a side note.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if actually, now that I'm thinking about this a little more, because I know this is like copy paste from state language and stuff. Should that, some of these like carve outs we're talking about fit in the operator agreement?
Mhm.
Potentially. Yeah.
That might be where you put in a couple of these carve
Well,
outs.
And
and
I
so
like
the
that
other,
idea. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Because as I've said, I think in this group before, things like this are intended to be minimums. They're not
Mhm.
intended to be catch-alls for like each and every project. They're not
Mhm.
meant to be a one size fits all.
Yeah.
So where we can leave the broadest base possible to allow maximum flexibility for the potential operators and vendors and all the other people, I think that's what makes the most sense. So if there is a way to put it in elsewhere where it can be more adaptable,
Mhm.
that makes more sense to me, maybe.
Okay. We'll take that note and then revise, potentially add that language in there. The other thing I was going to say is, right, the way this is worded, this is not exclusive language. This is essentially saying, especially related to rental history, criminal history. Like, these are things that would typically keep somebody out of subsidized or unsubsidized housing. And so this housing in particular is meant to provide a housing option for those folks. But like, if you removed this language right here, sure, this clarifies a few things in terms of what we're talking about, and that's good for a definition. This isn't actually saying these are the only housing types, or even that these, or not housing, these are the only, history or past behaviors that would keep someone from having subsidized housing in another space. So, right, this language could be removed altogether, and it could be clarified somewhere else, like in an operator agreement or something, or it could be kept, and we could further define criminal history. I mean, there's a couple different ways to go about it, but it does get into a sticky spot where I do have to research how far you can define it before it becomes uh, unfairly restrictive. So, uh, oh, Karina, I saw that you just joined as well, and you have your hand up.
Yeah, I joined a little bit ago. Um, Thank you for sending me the Zoom link. On this topic, I think it's really important that we do include, caveats. What I do like the idea of some of this language being the operator agreement. For the most part, much of this housing includes in their own good neighbor agreements. Provisions for acceptance, and that can be serious violent crime, conviction history, the level of that a violent crime can be a status barrier, and it should not be prevented from our discussion or recommendations. But common examples are serious violent, criminal history, sex trafficking, selling of manufactured or illegal substances. Those are usually a status level of prevention in local housing for permanent supportive housing or temporary supportive housing, especially within certain distances according to state law from areas that children highly frequent, which are schools. You're not going to see uh, sex offenders be able to access housing within 6 miles of an elementary school, for example, um, or highly populated parks.
Well, and
And
traditionally HUD doesn't give housing vouchers to anyone
exactly.
long
That's Thank you
sentence anyway, so.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you exactly. But it doesn't hurt to not. It doesn't hurt to stipulate, at least in language, what we expect to see and what we don't expect to see. And these are pretty common language pieces that are even in, like within Plymouth Housing's agreements that they have with Bellevue. And the city of Bellevue and the city of Shoreline include um, some of this language. So I think it does matter what kind of language we include. I think we might want it to be a little bit more specific. Um,
And to confirm,
and
Karina, you're saying that they include that language in their good neighbor agreements and operator agreements, right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
I just want to make sure where we're talking about here. Okay.
great. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll do a little bit of research, get back to the group on even just what's possible here, but also it does sound like there's consensus within at least this group to have some of that specificity put to the agreements versus having this definition further refined to be down to a particular time length or down to a particular, exclude certain crimes and those types of things. So I think we'll progress with that. The next question that I did have on the presentation, we'll see if this comes back up, is on what we talked about earlier of type 1 or type 2 or even type 3. I mean, those are the three processes. It was mentioned about, should this go to a type 3 process? We did see some of that feedback. So it's interesting to have the discussion. I talked a little bit earlier about what's currently written into the draft. We can talk about how we want this to be reviewed. We can also pull up the code language. I believe we pulled up, or we included all the language about what these different, once I get past all the use tables. Sorry if this is making you dizzy at all. I will stop when I get to the process portion. Okay, we talk a little bit here about, well, this is just the expedited portion. So this is the language under, but we can also go through and look at this section right here for classifications of land use decision process. So just so everyone's aware, type 1 decisions are made by the city manager. They're non-appealable administrative decisions that require the exercise of little or no administrative discretion. Public notice is not required for type 1. Type 2 are made by the city manager. They are discretionary decisions that are subject to administrative appeal. And then type 3 decisions are quasi-judicial. They're made by the hearing examiner. I believe, oh yeah, they're appealed to King County Superior Court. So there are different types of processes, even to type 4 and type 5 decisions that are made by city council. So there are different options, right, for how this housing gets evaluated. Typical residential housing, non-step related or even affordable housing is a type 2 with the exception of the affordable housing provision that we talked about earlier. With if certain findings are made, it can fall under this, essentially the language is right here, it can fall under this type 1 process. So want to open it up to the group a little bit and just see what we're thinking about in terms of the process and what we think is important for this.
So just so I'm clear, it's not until type 3 where any notification is required.
I'm trying to remember, Debbie.
He give us, I feel like I want Debbie to take the floor and explain a little bit of this.
Okay, when it says city manager, it's basically or designee, and currently the designee for approving permits is in development services, so it's the development service director when you see city manager, just to
Okay.
get everybody on that same page. Typically, a type 1 permit does not trigger noticing requirements to neighbors. Unless, for example, it triggers an environmental review, SEPA. A type 2 permit process does trigger notice requirements to the neighbors to say, hey, there's something going on. So then there's a public comment period. If it also triggers environmental review, then that's another opportunity for public comment. And then once the decision is issued, there's an opportunity to appeal, and that appeal would then go to the hearing examiner. The type 3 then is where the staff then make a presentation to the hearing examiner. The hearing examiner makes a decision. So there is an opportunity, there's notice about that, you know, here's a project, you can provide comments. Again, if there's environmental review, there's additional comments period related to that. And then the hearing examiner's decision then is appealed to court. So typically, if you're going to provide comment or you file an appeal, you have to have some standing to do that, which means you can't just kind of not do anything throughout the process and show up at the end and go, oh, I don't like it. So the idea of having the notice and the ability to comment is that if somebody did want to file an appeal, you can say, I've been involved in this the whole way along. Now I'm going to file an appeal, whether that's through the general comment period or through the SEPA environmental process. So, and usually it's sort of a level of complexity in terms of the type of permit process. So it's usually simpler permits have a simpler process, more complex types of permits, then the level of complexity increases till you get to something like a type 5 permit process, which is one example is where there's a planning commission recommendation related to amendment to the comprehensive plan, which goes to the council for then legislative action. So again, it's that broad spectrum of simple permits to very complex kind of permits.
And if I can just add something real quickly, Debbie said that way better than I did, so I'm really glad that she stepped in and said that. So where it's written into the land use decision types and referenced is, again, this affordable housing project and step housing as described in this section of the municipal code. So that would be a type 1. And then if it were to follow type 2, it's just a site plan review for uses allowed by zone. These would be uses allowed. So that's kind of how the language falls right now for just thinking about where these would typically fall. So with that, I mean, the question is, I mean, what do we like how it's presented right now? Do we want to have, change this process at all? Do we want to, remove the step housing exemption portion from the affordable housing? What does the group think?
I mean, this is one that I sent you a comment on, but yeah, I mean, I think given the history and kind of the transparency component of STEP in this community, I don't think type 1 is a good strategy to move forward with here, because it will again appear like the city is just trying to slip by these projects. And so, I mean, my feeling here is that we have to, in some way, allow public notice and awareness of the projects. Again, I think PSH is going to be the most debated. The other three, I doubt we'll have a lot of debate around them. So we could debate 2s versus 3s, but I don't think no notice straight through would be well received by the community.
What level of notice are you looking for?
I don't know. I mean, are there different levels of, I mean, obviously, I think at a minimum, you would have to send letters to people that are impacted within a certain radius of the project. Typically, right, you put the poster board, and then I don't know at what level we decide that something needs to be mentioned in city communications. I think the issue, and kind of to the earlier comments around residents feeling like the city is just trying to slip these projects through and isn't in cahoots with various operators. If if permits were to be issued without any sort of public notice, that would 100% reconfirm those sentiments from those community members. So whether that's true or not, I don't think even matters. I think the reality is just you need to acknowledge that people want to know about this because it has a direct impact on them.
But I guess sort of to play this out, and I'm sorry, I apparently came in later than I thought. If we allow public notice and then public is able to give feedback, but state law requires that we permit these types of housing in areas where residential or hotels are allowed, then we go through this process of like, hey, we did this public notice, you all gave a bunch of feedback, and then we ignored it because we have to allow this anyway. And I don't know that that creates a better outcome than just saying, hey, this is an administrative process, it's an over-the-counter permit, just like if you wanted to put a deck on your house, this is how we're doing it. I mean, I guess it's not over the
I
counter, but
actually
it's
think
like
this is,
done by the city manager.
yeah, I actually think this plus changes to the operating and good tenant agreements would be a good way to provide community education about change, like how this is going through. I don't think people fully understand everything that you just articulated.
I completely 100% agree with you after reading all of the comments that we've received. I think that there's still a lot of resistance because people think that there's an opportunity for resistance. And that's where I would have hesitation saying, okay, yeah, let's put in a process where people are able to give feedback again, because we're just going to get a rinse and repeat of what we've already been experiencing. We're going to get those same comments of, we don't want this in our neighborhood. And then our community is left in the position of feeling like we're not being heard because we can't actually action on any of those comments. We do not have the opportunity to say, yes, we're going to change what we're doing in response to what you've said. We just, like, our hands are tied. So I agree. I think there needs to be teeth to the operator agreement. That's one of the notes that I came with today. And I think
Yeah.
there's other changes that we really should talk about so that we make the community, we help the community feel like this is something that we are being responsive to what they've said in the ways that we are able, but I don't want to give them a false sense of input when they just don't have it.
And I also want to add on that, I mean, these voices are one voice in the community, but I mean, as I echoed earlier, we have voices in the community who don't even feel safe showing up to meetings because they heard their, I mean, even as Josh said, we have people saying, I don't think we're ready for PSH, and they're thinking, I need PSH. PSH is my home, and my neighbors are saying, I'm not ready for my neighbor to have a home.
I'm not ready for you.
I'm not ready for you. I'm not ready for you. Like why would they want to show up to a community meeting? So this is one important voice, but it's not the only voice we should be listening to. And so I agree with you that our operator agreement. Also, I keep thinking, like, I've gone to the financial sustainability open houses. There's a big push for us not doing duplicative work and for us to be really efficient as a city. And part of me exactly like, are we gonna do all of this if we can't do anything about it and
Yeah.
have more staff time and more, I don't know, I just want to be really cognizant about where we are expecting our staff to put their efforts in and bill their hours. And I want it to be really efficient and really effective. I love that Debbie said at previous meetings that all of the big developments are already online, which is free. We don't need a mailer for that, or I mean, it's already bundled into the existing cost. And so I'm with you. If there's something that the community can change, of course I want their voice, but I don't want to bait and switch them and get them burned out on engagement if something can't be changed. So I think it's a tricky tension.
So I know Karina has her hand up. I did want to offer up one thing that I've seen in the past where projects that are allowed by right, where a developer does not need like, right, the city can only make findings of are you consistent with the code? Are you consistent with development standards, and not discretion, and not, make changes because of public comment. I have seen developers in the past still be responsive to public comment. And so the fact that they get the public comment at all, regardless of whether they need to make changes or not, sometimes, I'm not saying all, sometimes developers say, okay, we want to be good community partners. We understand that there are these things that the community has expressed, and we're going to take those into consideration and potentially make changes. They're not required to, right? Depending on the type of project, but at least it's a venue where they received the feedback and then they can make the decision. I do completely understand it could be frustrating from a community standpoint to say I gave my feedback and it was ignored. So there does have to be some level of understanding from the community of, hey, this is a great opportunity to provide feedback. Here's the parameters that we're working within, and what this applicant is required to do and what they're not required to do. But it is right, sometimes requiring uh, some level of outreach or some level of public comment, or noticing at least gives people the chance to make a comment. So I just wanted to add that in there. Not advocating one way or the other.
I do want to be clear. Sorry, Karina. I'm jumping ahead. I'm very pro community engagement. And I want that to be accessible. Also, I know that sometimes there are exactly as you said, Nick, there are some things that can be changed on some levels. I know that with the Imagine Habitat project coming up, we had some community meetings and some people were getting really nitty gritty in the weeds about like directions of sidewalks and tree preservation and the initial diagrams, and their feedback wasn't about should the project happen. It was about what's the best walking ways for the children to get to school, and like it was the urban design engagement of it, right? And so I love community engagement when we are talking about what's the best fit for urban design for our community. And I don't know, I don't want to, I don't want to say that all community engagement is going to be a riot at 3 a.m. where neighbors feel unheard. Obviously, we have a lot of voices, we have a lot of experiences, we have a lot of expertise, and feedback is really valuable. I don't want to assume that everyone who comes out to a housing event is going to come out angry and hate their neighbors.
Yeah, that's great feedback. Karina, I know you've had your hand up for a bit.
Thank you very much. The state's very clear with the more recent language adoption by the legislature and actions to reduce discriminatory local actions. So we're talking about permit process, and so I want to make sure we're staying on topic. But with permit process, this seems pretty straightforward, where you see surrounding cities who are doing leading work here. The status is a council notification. The executive is giving an update to the council, and so they're hearing about this publicly this way. And when it comes to the operators are pre-engaging the community through their best practices. And you see that across the works of high performing operators providing this kind of community opportunity, that they're providing open houses for community engagement early, frequent, and often. So code wise, I'm comfortable with the code. I think where there's concern, of course, is if there's major changes or adaptations that the operator is expecting or requesting. And those can be minor or major. I think the major is the component where our community cares. They want to know if there's going to be a great impact to the environment. They want to know if there's encroachment. They want to know, if there's safe routes, that sort of thing. But since we're just talking about permitting and the process of permitting, I just want to bring it back and dial it back to making sure we're staying on topic with this. And I'm comfortable with the permit process as long as the executive of the city is providing an update to the council before the public. And that the permit process engagement is clearly, denoted, so that if there is room for engagement, that it's done so through the proper channels and that earlier process and documented.
So I thank you for that, Karina. I want to go back and again confirm. I was doing a little bit of reading while Debbie, while you were talking. We're basically talking about whether these are noticed, and Debbie confirmed type one projects that go through the type one process do not need council notification. They do not need any of that, correct? That it is administrative, it is handled by the planning department, and it is not something that would go to what Karina was just talking about. It's not something that a director would take to the council and make a presentation or anything like that.
Correct.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. Uh, just want to make sure we're on the same page because again, I do agree, Karina, with what you said about like best practices for a step housing operator. We would hope that they would do a lot of community outreach, that they would engage with the community and be part of it. But this is setting the baseline of what they have to do versus what they may choose to do on their own.
Right.
So that's what I just
Are
want to
you, are
make sure.
you, are you proposing that in the operator agreement, we put that they have to conduct community outreach?
Karina, I think that was that to you, Karina, or to me?
Yeah, I was asking Karina. I thought that's what you were
Gotcha.
kind of getting at was, sounds like the best operators are already doing this. Are you saying that we would make that a minimum requirement of an operating agreement that they do public education and outreach?
City executives already usually engage this, basic plateau as a recommended guidance and or a highly suggested. The operators themselves usually engage this themselves without prompting. But if that makes everyone else feel more comfortable, that we stipulate that be part of the operator agreement, I'm fine with that because you're talking about preserving community um, inf- informed, uh, being informed about the process and, you know, being educated about what's occurring through the operator. Um, and also that there's that proper and healthy way for engagement. When you're talking about permits, it's a different level of engagement when a person's filing for a permit versus getting into the thicker weeds. Entering the process of housing or development of any kind is a long process, uh,
Yeah.
and
Well,
you're just not going to see any city who's doing leading work um, on these issues with healthy policy and guardrails in place, interrupting like a really basic permitting process at the ground floor level. That's one more of an elevated plateau.
I guess I'm not quite sure when you say elevated plateau what you're referring to. I just want to make sure that I have the correct.
An
I'm
elevated
making
plateau
sure.
would be, like a major variance, a major change in what our code stipulates for building, for safety. Like you have emergency and fire code standards. If there was some huge deviation that impacted those, that would that would trigger a process.
Okay,
And
so you're saying
and
those things should go to a council review, but if it's a minor process, it should not go to. That's what you're saying.
there would be a discussion brought by development, notification, and whether or not um, the council would approve of, like a major variance like that. Um,
And
Yeah,
that
I think if sorry, Josh, real quick. I think if someone is proposing something outside of what is permitted, or what is permitted if someone is a permitted use and following development standards that are in place and all of that. Um, if someone's proposing a process outside of that,
Yes.
then yes, then there's separate processes for that. I think this is for specifically here, we're talking about if someone proposes a project, step housing project that aligns with the current use standards, everything that's applicable. This is the process that we go through. So, okay, sorry, Josh, I cut you off.
You asked the same, answered the question I was going to ask, which is, I think all of the existing code would cover if it was outside of that.
Yeah, if you're, and again, and this, so some of the findings that we were talking about earlier, if it also needs any of these, so a short subdivision, zoning variance, a CUP, a shoreline permit, or critical areas exemptions, it wouldn't be allowed to go into the type 1 process. It would default to type 2. So that's the findings that need to get made for it to go to type 1 when we talk about that exemption portion. The other thing I wanted to maybe clarify, because I heard it come up, is if it was something that this committee wanted to see for engagement, notification and engagement ahead of approval of a project, that probably wouldn't go in a good neighbor agreement or operator agreement, because the operator agreement is just between the operator and residents, and then the good neighbor agreement goes into effect when everybody has signed it and it's part of a formal agreement when the project's approved. So you would typically in that good neighbor agreement, you may include, hey, we want to do a community check-in 90 days in, after operation starts, or annual check-in with the community or something like that. That would be after operation starts. And that would be applicable under that agreement, but that agreement wouldn't be in place as someone's going through the application process. So if it was this committee's desire to see uh, engagement ahead or during the application process ahead of a decision, then it probably need to be in the code somewhere.
I
So I
guess,
just want to clarify that portion.
yeah, it seems like one of the things that they could check off as part of the application requirements is, hey, yes, we did community engagement. But for the knowledge only of the provider instead of as information for the city in order to review, like to approve or deny the permit.
Mm-hmm.
I guess. I understand the benefit of doing the engagement on the provider's behalf and that, good providers would do that on their own. I'm just very wary of, like, even when we had the open house, there was so much community confusion about how much input and say they got in it. And people do not read and they do not listen.
Yeah.
And I'm not exempt from this. I thought the meeting started at 6 today, so, it's really, there is a lot of room for error and we really have to be careful because when people feel like they've been tricked or they've been, kind of had the wool pulled over their eyes in one way or another, they're going to be even more resistant to a project. Whereas if we say, hey, like these projects are going to be outright permitted as part of the code, and as part of that process, if someone is planning a project in your area, it will be written on the city's website that this is being applied for, and they will do outreach to you if you're within a certain area. And you can provide feedback to them directly, to help them understand what the community needs and concerns are, but that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
I do agree that the big difference, right, is that these are permitted uses now. And if someone meets all development standards that are in the code and they are permitted use, this just gets treated like every other permitted use within that zone. So it is a good clarification because people will see permanent supportive housing differently than they see other housing projects that are allowed by right. So, okay, so that was really good. Through all that, I don't think I heard any changes. I think we want to potentially, what I keep coming back to is somewhere we want to include language, and then maybe it's not in the code, maybe it's somewhere else that is either a requirement or a highly recommended that applicants who are proposing permanent supportive housing do some sort of outreach up front. And I think maybe that's a distinguishing factor is it required somewhere in the code? We could specify projects that propose permanent supportive housing are required to do community, one community meeting that is to gather feedback, to gather feedback from the community. That is not, none of the things that come out of that could be used for denial of a project or anything like that. It is purely to gather community feedback and provide information. Like there is a scenario potentially where we could put something like that into the code that just says, hey, you need to do this, hold this meeting, um, or do some sort of equivalent outreach or something like that.
Is there a licensing requirement on the city level for step housing in any sense?
We asked, Debbie, we asked that question of Sam earlier, I think, right? And she just said it depends on whether, not for the residential component, but for operating, if they operate as a business, I think is what she had said. Is that?
Yeah, business, yeah, so it's like, you don't require a license to have a housing project, but if it's operating as a business, then they might need a business license. It's a fine line, which I didn't have a chance to follow up with Sam to sort of say.
Okay,
what
yeah,
that means.
okay, so yes, long-term residential housing, like a landlord doesn't need a permit to have a rental
Right.
property.
Right.
But if you were a short-term rental property, then you would need a permit or if you were a like emergency services provider, a clinic or whatever else, some of their kind of compatible services that step might be, that could require a permit.
It could trigger a business license.
Yeah, especially if you were providing on-site services for people who are off-site, there potentially could be one there as well. It kind of depends. But we're going to try and get more clarification from Sam on that as well. But if it's just, sorry, go ahead.
It seems like if there's a licensing requirement, then that could be rolled into that part of it rather than the development, which is different, which is just like a land use sort of question.
Yeah. By the way, we're gathering all these notes as
You
well,
have
so
to-
we'll compile them.
I guess just in terms of like the order in which those things would happen, then you would actually have to get the license ahead of the permit though, right?
Well, so
I don't
it's
know.
interesting.
Not necessarily.
Yeah.
So you could get the permit, but then not be able to build until you have the license, or you could build and then not get the permit? Is that how that would
You
work?
could just, the license would be to operate, right? So you could
Yeah, it'd be prior to certificate of occupancy. I think
ready
is what it would
to
be.
go, and then you could have the license be like one of the last steps. Because, I mean, holding up a project for community engagement, it could take, depending on the size of the project, it could take years.
Yeah.
And as we saw, community engagement can also take years. So,
I do
mean,
think that there's a challenge there. Some of the feedback people provide will likely be on the development aspects. And so if you tie it to certificate of occupancy, it's almost like it's too late to give a portion of the feedback.
you would have broken ground at that point, and it'll feel like, what's the point?
So I think
I mean,
we're looking into
if
this.
there's a way to put it in here, I would love to see something like that at least encourages it. I mean, I realize there's going to be.
If you look at all the, I'll say, negative comments or like we were talking earlier, all the people in the community that just don't understand what all this is, the different levels of housing, it really feels like we need to give some type of opportunity for community feedback.
So is the committee good with us? And I know we've had a few people join us since we kind of talked in the beginning, but what we plan to do, because we're not meeting until the 7th, we're not going to council until the 17th, is finalize our documents based on this conversation and send those back out for our last review by the committee and any comments. So is the committee good with us finding a place to make a recommendation or to require applicants to either require or make a recommendation that community outreach be done as part of the project. Again, not because it's well, I guess if you required it, the act of holding a community meeting would be one of the requirements needing to be met. None of the feedback gathered during that would be required to be met in terms of like if someone said, hey, I think it should be no more than one story, that wouldn't be a requirement or anything. So is the committee okay with us adding language that says a project applicant either should or shall hold a community meeting?
Sure.
Okay.
Like we
Okay.
need to.
We'll draft some language like that and figure out where it fits best. I do think it needs to be outside of the agreements though, because those agreements are really in place once the project is approved and those agreements are entered into. So it needs to probably be somewhere else. But we'll keep going. Karina, you have your hand raised. Any last points on that topic?
Yeah, I think it's important to follow that proceed before we pre-seed model. That's kind of the expectation of operators, is getting that community feedback and then adapting your project to fit your local community. Usually a requirement to have community informed meetings and updates done by the operator is something that cities do recommend, and it's in a more current recommendations via environmental justice, which includes housing, has really good language around this that you might want to take a look at.
Okay. Yeah, we'll absolutely take a look at that. Yeah, I think, yeah, to your point and to what everyone said so far, right? We would all hope that a good operator would do these things and go above and beyond these requirements. This is sort of setting the baseline for what they would need to do. So I think if we're all thinking about it, right? If someone comes through with a permanent supportive housing project and they talk to the city and say, hey, what should we do? There's a very high likelihood, and I don't want to speak for Debbie or anybody at the city, but they would say, hey, it's highly recommended that you would do some community outreach because we've seen in the past that it's important to the community. So, okay, there was also, so last thing on updates and permitting process before we go to the agreements, and I do recognize what time it is, and I know I knew this meeting would go longer, and so if anybody has to,
Yeah, I
oh, sorry.
apologize. Gotta go. I'm actually working right now and I have a call I have to take. in a
I'm
few
sorry, yeah.
So I apologize. I thought we would be done sooner. So I'll keep an eye on my emails, but I didn't have any specific changes to the agreements, just to put that out there. I
Okay.
figured there'd be some conversation, but I'm not overly concerned. I think the committee is generally on the same page, so I'm not super concerned about it.
Thank you for going a little bit long. I appreciate that. And I'm sorry to extend on. For everyone else, if you do have to go at some point, please just let us know. We'll try and wrap us up by 7 o'clock and give opportunities to provide feedback. But I know I just figured this one might go a little long. So,
Excuse me, just real quickly.
yeah.
The city of Portland, for example, has a business permitting requirement, and they have two safety issues there that are included to protect the community from harm. And one, you can't hurt anyone, so the business can't be hurting people within or causing harm to the community. And of course, you can't hold people against their will over 24 hours. Not that housing does that, but those are like two little elements that can cause a permit to operate within a city to be repealed. And why they're really minor statements, they actually are really important statements to a healthy, safe society for all. And I think that those might be worth looking at.
Okay, we will take a look and see how that language reads. In my mind at the moment, I'm not exactly sure what it's referencing, but we'll take a look and see how it reads. So the last comment on here was there was some discussion about potentially there are jurisdictions that require safety and security plans. There are some jurisdictions that have either required that on-site services be, well, I guess two things, that there are on-site services. Some jurisdictions say you can have on-site or off-site services and don't require them to be necessarily in that building. And then some require them solely for the residents of that building. I mean, does this group have any specific thoughts on any of those points? I guess I'll take the safety and security plan first. Right now, right, the agreement says, well, right now we default to the good neighbor agreement, and it doesn't have a safety and security plan in it. It has contacts listed. It has procedures laid out that say, you know, operators and residents must follow certain things. There is not a specific, as part of the permitting process, safety and security plan that needs to be laid out. So I'm curious group's feelings on that.
That was part of the reason that I mentioned or that I asked about licensing, was because one of the pieces of consistent feedback that we received was that the good neighbor agreements and operator agreements didn't have any teeth. And I think if we have a licensing system that is like the backstop for that, where in order to maintain your operation as, you know, a step housing provider, you have to be in compliance and take those seriously, where you can't just like ignore violations of the good neighbor agreement or the operator agreement and continue on because your use is permitted by code. You actually have to have a license to operate that type of a business or a facility. I think that provides the backstop that our community needs to say, okay, well, there is recourse if we're not actually going by our good neighbor agreements and enforcing them on our resident, you know, in terms of our residents, something else can happen. There are consequences, because the way that they are written right now are just agreements with no consequences.
Okay, that is a great point. So one thing just to respond to that we'll have to look into, right, is it currently, as the city operates, would these qualify and require some sort of business, or could they require some sort of business license in order to operate? We'll talk to development services on that and figure out if that's something that could. And then from a state perspective, is that an overly restrictive thing, and is that something that can be put into place? So we'll just have to take a look at those two things and see how those interplay with that.
I think this is critical though. Like, I'm 1,000% behind what Caitlin just said there, because that is what the community is looking for, is to say there is some enforcement of these agreements that have not existed in the other communities that I've seen these built in. And if there is no ability to shut down a facility that is operating outside of its good neighbor agreement, that's where these things go south. Right. So I think this is critical to have that included in our final recommendation.
Okay. Karina, you have your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. I concur. It's really important to listen to our community and also take a look at best policy standards and best policy code and zoning out there. City of Shoreline has done really great work here, and as has the city of Bellevue. They both require and include safety security plans in their good neighbor plan or good neighbor agreement and operating agreement. And as part of that, they also include maps for, um, you know, the area in which you would um,
Kind of setting the boundaries of where this is
excuse me,
applicable.
just sore throat.
Yeah.
The areas outlined in which you would be notifying your community, but it includes transportation maps. It also requires that the police chief checks off on that safety security plan, which is important. There's elements to building. Most of these housing types have already operate and put in place, whether it's a safe security entrance and on-site staffing. Those are different issues. but they're important issues. And I think they deserve to have a high quality overlook. I wouldn't want to see Kenmore move forward without an inclusion of a safety and security plan for moving ahead. And that's just because it's a best quality standard. And that makes sure that everybody's informed about how this works and how we move ahead in a healthy, sustainable way that works for everyone.
Okay. Yeah, I think having that, and so really what that is it's an expansion, and we'll get into the good neighbor agreement in a little bit. It's an expansion of what's in the good neighbor agreement. Currently, I'll say it because of some of the discussions we've had previously are trying to limit the restrictions. The good neighbor agreement requires primary points of contact. It requires police notification and at different points. So this would be essentially adding levels of detail to that where someone has to define particular entrances. They have to provide these different ways that safety and security can be ensured. So if that's important to the group, we can come back with a version of the good neighbor agreement that includes more of these details in it.
I don't think that's just important to the group, but it's also important to our community. And we heard that through many meetings and even some input in different ways. But when you're looking at best quality standards and people who are cities who are doing it well, I think following that suggestive hint is not such a bad way to go. I mean, I wouldn't want us to operate the same way Seattle does, but I would want to see us operate with a healthier process that safely supports everyone involved. And a safety and security plan does that in a holistic way and in a healthy way.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts on that? If not, we'll bring that forward. Okay. So we've kind of launched into the proposed good neighbor agreement. I think the one thing, Josh, you had sent a number of comments as well. The way it is currently drafted, right? It is intended to. It is a format that needs to be filled out, and so a lot of the language in there is placeholder that you need to replace, operator with the actual operator name. You need to replace city with the name and add that information in there. So that is how it's intended to be used. It's not something that can be signed as is. It's something that needs to be kind of catered to the specific developments. And so that's how it's laid out, but essentially defines, it's between the city development operator and appropriate parties, whether that's a neighboring business, whether it's a neighbor association, individual property owners. That's what the agreement.
Those comments were from someone who just sent that back to me.
Gotcha. Okay.
I think I don't want to miss your last point, which is should or shouldn't they require on-site services?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go.
That's a pretty big question here, I think. It seems like the best in class do require. And that was, part of the concern on Plymouth was the lack of services available.
So we have a huge problem in Kenmore with that because we are not zoned in most of the community for businesses. It is solely residential. So I think if we're gonna say we require on-site services, what we need to do is allow for corner stores throughout the R zone neighborhoods. And I think that that's if we as a community are serious about providing permanent supportive housing to residents with either on-site services or services within, like, say, a quarter of a mile or a few blocks that could potentially serve multiple smaller units or multiple smaller step developments or communities instead of one larger one, we absolutely need to include in our recommendation to city council a hard look at zoning and rezoning for allowance for corner stores, if not throughout the entire community, at least on the minor arterials, like run them up Simons and 68th and 61st and like wherever else in the community that makes sense. But you can't require that kind of service it's like, you can't say, oh yeah, we allow stuff everywhere in the city, but then it requires an on-site service, which you're actually not allowed to do in this,
No.
in that
Isn't
does
that part
not.
of the, I think, isn't what you're, like the corner idea, isn't that part of the recommendations of the planning committee right now? Like I thought that very question was coming up in the next calendar year.
It was discussed at the state level last year. It's been circulating for a
Awful
couple
did it,
years.
Seattle
Yeah.
has talked about it. It's like
But
in the
it's not on
ether
the
right
agenda
now.
to be approved right now for.
I did not see it on their docket for this
I haven't seen
year.
it for late.
Debbie, help us out here.
I'll find.
You're the staff person.
It is not on the current planning commission or council work program for
Yeah.
2025. It is an item that was identified when we went through the middle housing
Mhm.
discussion. And there was a white paper that sort of initially looked at where the locations could be. So it's a future work program item. It's just a question of when that comes up. I know it's been in front of the legislature a couple of times.
Mhm.
Whether that will come back this next go around again, then whether it'll be a state requirement and a mandate rather than an option is to be determined. But it's certainly something that is on the list of many things to look at.
Just shuffle it to the top with our recommendations here.
So I think the question though is and maybe Nick, this is something to think about, is if there was a permanent supportive housing project which had on-site services, that could be considered sort of an accessory to the primary use.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there could be a scenario where it's permitted, even though, let's say, commercial uses are not a permitted use within that zone. It is, like Debbie said, an accessory, and it would be, you define what the supportive services are, and say that those are permitted. Again, we have to clarify if it's permitted only on site or if it's permitted off site as well, in which case you would have to, there would have to, that would start to get a little sticky of it being permitted offsite, because then there'd be, how far could it be, what, size requirements, those different types of things. It's a much, right, cleaner, it's a much cleaner thing code wise to require it on site. That's not saying
Yeah,
that's a reason to require it on site, but it's just logistically.
so what gets sticky here, and I think the reason that this needs a lot more examination is that my recollection, unless they've changed in the last couple months, about Kenmore's home-based business requirements through the R zones is that you can have all of one employee and you can't have it be open to anyone else. You can't have anybody come visit it. So it wouldn't be open to anyone offsite, but you could also only have one employee. And I think that that might be an issue. So if
Mhm.
I just, I think that there's a really there's more work that needs to be done to reconcile what we're talking about with step housing with what our current zoning allows in the residential neighborhoods and in terms of business use of properties in those neighborhoods. And the reason I would advocate for allowing for like corner stores or neighborhood businesses is because anywhere in that residential zone, our zoning is low density enough that it is infeasible to think that somebody's gonna be able to like jam a step housing community of any size plus whatever their on-site services are on the same parcel and make that work financially. There needs to be some coordination, I think, with, or we're mindful about saying, okay, well, if your step housing community serves less than 25 people or fewer, then you can have offsite, but as soon as you have 26 people, you need to have onsite. So that we're actually not increasing the burden on those individual providers and we're allowing for something that will work not only for the providers, but for community scale, right? Because if we
Mhm.
box people out of doing this in the neighborhood, then the only option is to do it across from the hangar, which is where we had the problem last time. So if we want people to build step housing, then we need to create the code on all of the levels that will allow them to do it in a way that's palatable to their community. And I
Mhm.
think that we don't get that unless we, have some mindfulness about like how the various elements of step that differ from residential use are going to integrate into the residential neighborhoods if they are at all.
Yeah. Okay. We will coordinate that with development services again. I think there is one thing you mentioned there is one thing we did hear consistently throughout the feedback is that there was a desire to see step housing more dispersed throughout the city and not concentrated just in the downtown area. And that does, because of the zoning, that does mean smaller projects in different areas throughout the city. I think that was kind of consistent feedback that we did hear.
I mean,
Well, yeah.
I really like the idea of requiring it for like 30 plus and then making them available, whether they be outpatient or whatever, for anything under that, so you don't set up the catch 22 like you're talking about. Um, I did look at Lake City Partners. I think that currently services 28 people today. So that would be like right at, that seems like a very workable model. It's right exactly in the type of zoning you're talking about. That seems to me like a really good solve here.
Okay. Karina, you have your hand up as well.
Yes, I'd like to support, everything that has just been discussed. I think it's absolutely on point, and it speaks to not only the needs of, our growing community, but also how our community will accept and support ongoing continued development. But we do need to address the ability to provide services. We do need to update our mixed use business code and zoning, um, and the corner store businesses. This home-based business code that says you only can have one employee is discriminatory practice for coding of this type. And I believe that needs an update as well. So I just wanted to add that. And
The
I
other
think
thing,
that a business that is providing SEP housing is, and they usually do provide services, you're probably going to see, and it is nice to see caseworkers on site. That's a requirement for STEP housing with the state code. And the kind of services that are included with STEP housing are behavioral and social health services. So having a business operating agreement seems practical.
Yeah. I think the group's pretty consistently in agreement with that. So okay. So I think we covered that. I think we need to come back a little bit more and we will set some parameters on sizing requirements and then look at whether this is ancillary, if it's not on site, and how that it gets classified in the zoning, how it gets permitted. So we'll need to talk to development services about that. Okay. We talked a little bit about these agreements. Again, define the geographic areas, kind of what Karina was mentioning earlier, where this applies to, defines roles and responsibilities for all parties, identifies primary points of contact, and describes communication and escalation process for concerns. I'm curious with this group for both the good neighbor agreements and the operator agreements, if there's any content changes of those that you want to see, or if it's more on the enforcement side, like we talked about earlier, of these just need to have a way to have some level of enforceability, otherwise they're going to get ignored, or there's essentially, if there's no punishment, maybe punishment's the wrong word, if there's no action that can be taken if someone breaks it, then is it really any kind of agreement? And I will just remind this group that earlier in a previous meeting, we did talk about not requiring one of these agreements because, well, I should say that back. We talked about requiring that someone make the effort to enter into these agreements with the surrounding properties. We didn't want to make it so that a surrounding property could say, well, I'm not going to sign this agreement, so you can't build your housing, and have it be a way that someone could stop a project, right? So in that sense, we made, I think the recommendation was that it is strongly recommended. And we could even change the language now to sound good because there's so much discussion on these to basically say, you must make the attempt to enter into an agreement, or at least make contact with surrounding property owners to discuss an agreement or something of that level, but stop short of requiring it, so it's not a way that somebody could prevent a project from happening.
It could be that it is a required notification sent out to the surrounding businesses via, tracked means. So the way that looks in other cities, it can be a fax, it can be a certified letter, an email, and a way to track that it's been delivered, and that stipulates what the good neighbor agreement is, and here we are, here's how you contact us, and here's the process. The city then also provides something similar with a fax notification now to the surrounding businesses. Since we don't have in Kenmore a way to track landlords who lease properties and are operating their businesses that way, there really isn't a good way to contact them. And I think that's why you see in other cities that it's businesses that are notified. And it's just a notification requirement.
I guess it raises two questions in my mind. One, that kind of puts us back in a scenario where, like, even if we're in the type 1 process, notification through this separate requirement for noticing this. So
Almost seem
that's
like
one
the
thing. And
way.
then the other is, yeah, we would need to define where the committee wants to see that parameter set. Is it just properties that are businesses or that share a property line? Is it within a certain distance? I mean, there are a number of ways I think you could do it. And I think the question being, like, where is the impact? Like, where potentially would you want to see? Is it any businesses within 500 feet? Is it just businesses that are directly adjacent? Or I say businesses, any kind of property.
That's where the city of Bellevue and the city of Redmond and Shoreline use that identified mapping area for the area in which is outlined for the safety and security plan as part of the notification area.
Yeah.
Is
So
it,
you're actually bringing up a good piece here, though. Like, obviously, you don't want to set up a good neighbor agreement that someone could then use to block the project. But if we have an operating license that's then referencing behavior that's outlined in a good neighbor agreement, then does that language then have to be repeated in the license itself?
couldn't it just reference it?
I think it would be by reference. Yeah, it would be.
But what if they don't sign the good neighbor agreement?
No, well, the good neighbor agreement, it's like the license is conditioned on the facility itself enforcing the good neighbor agreement, not necessarily the neighbor signing the good neighbor agreement. So the facility has to agree to what that agreement is and kind of enforcing that code on their residents, right? But the
That's what, like, where's the agreement
I
for the
think
city and the
actually what it is I think actually what it probably is the it's the business license being tied to enforcement of the operator agreement, because the operator agreement is between the operator and their residents. So if there's a resident who is not abiding by that operator agreement, then and it's a neighbor, right? That let's say a neighbor notifies and says, "Hey, your resident, did X, Y, or Z." It would then be on the operator to say, "Okay, that's outside it, or that violates the agreement you signed. Here's the process we go through." Right? You have X amount of warnings, whatever it might be, and then if that continues, then that person, or then they could lose their operating or their business license because they are not enforcing their operating agreements.
well, there's stuff in the good neighbor agreement too that should be binding on the developer or manager of the step project, regardless of whether or not the neighboring parties agree to it, right? Like, keeping the sidewalks and property grounds free of litter and other debris, providing on-site services only to residents unless otherwise negotiated. Like, there's stuff in both of them, right? And I think the purpose of in my mind, the purpose of that licensing would be to, act as a backstop or some sort of repercussion if they're just like letting everything go to hell, right?
Yeah.
And not being a good neighbor. But I think both of them might need to be referenced in it, where complaints can be made against their license, and if it's. But there would have to be some sort of code enforcement process there, like. Kenmore would have to enforce codes at that point.
But I think before we get ourselves too wound up, that the
Yeah.
business license might be the answer. I think we
Yeah.
need to understand what the current requirements are for a business license.
Sure.
And what the teeth are in that. It's
Yeah.
like a business registration, which is typically something that you're
Nothing.
operating locally, but you
Mhm.
also have a state business license. Which again, it's a business to operate. So again, I don't know what the state rules are for revoking a business license to have a business.
Sure.
Or what the city does for
And
that. I
actually,
don't know.
as I said it, I realized that code enforcement is actually probably the proper channel for anything like this. That if they're not abiding by whatever the code is, which means that this would have to be part of the municipal code. Then that could be a complaint that was made to code enforcement to say, hey, the code says they have to abide by the good neighbor agreement and the operator agreement, and that's not happening. But the teeth would have to be some sort of like violation or fine or suspension of their ability to operate or something. Like there has to be something there. It can't just be, hey, we, amassed a bunch of complaints that never got looked at.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a problem, and we've talked about this a lot in terms of like a new development, but I think it's technically feasible that someone could just take an existing house and do very few modifications and turn it into some sort of step
Yeah, we
house.
talked a little earlier about conversion of existing buildings as well. So yeah, keep going. Sorry.
So that's just to say, like, if the good neighbor agreement and the operator agreement are integral parts of being able to successfully operate a step housing community within Kenmore, then having those tied to like the permit process, when it's conceivable that one might not need to go through that permitting process in order to open a step housing development, or do you need to do it as a change of use?
You think you'd still have to go through at least a type 1 to be able to change your use. Let's go back and double check that, but I think you at least still have to go through and maybe a change of use. I don't think you could just convert over,
Then
and
everyone.
certainly not if we put these requirements in place to have some of these agreements in place. You would have to have a way to go through that. So, but it does. Okay, so what I'm taking away is that whether we're not quite sure the venue for it yet, and when I say venue, whether it's business license, business agreement, or just part of the code, the group is in consensus that there needs to be a way for these to be enforceable, and there needs to be some way that somebody who is operating outside of the bounds of these agreements, whether it's a fee, whether it's something, is there is some kind of action in response to that.
I have to agree. I think, we're looking at basically kind of a business residential use, because we're talking about business and housing. If we really want to promote mixed use, I think we really have to talk about that. But no matter what, the good neighbor agreement, a good neighbor plan, and operating agreement are only enforceable if they are included in a addendum that are signed and agreed to by all parties, whether that's signed with the city, and then also signed with the leasers of the future residents. So and that's also clarified in the MRSC guidance to municipalities. So I think we want to make sure that our floor here is that this is all included in a addendum that's then signed and agreed to by parties. And I like the idea that we include a violation of the agreements fines or fees as an escalation, and then of course the loss. Because we have to be the best stewards of our community, and the agreement, uh, when entered into by all the best parties, sometimes things can go wrong. The only way to protect yourself and have it legally binding is to have an addendum that is signed along with everything else.
Yeah, so that we will have it be part of the recommendation that this be enforceable. I think really what it is this is an agreement between the city and the development operator mostly, and then it is provided to all the neighboring properties so that they have a process in place and they know. The only thing I'm thinking about is there some, I need to go back and read our agreement, is it our draft agreement, is there some level of, hey, surrounding properties are also agreeing to abide by certain things, like they're agreeing to follow a certain process if they're, to file a complaint and those types of things. To what level that those surrounding properties need to do that. I think that's one thing that we need to confirm in the agreement that we have.
We already do.
As,
If a business is operating outside of their agreement with the city to operate, they can have their business license, revoked. And
right.
so, usually when a business is investing in the community and finding its home and becoming part of the community, we'll want to be the best stewards. And so just having that all codified is really important. And I think that's logical and reasonable to expect that as a ground floor. And
Yeah.
also on the flip side, that the operator, when leasing to residents, always does include, larger operators do include a good neighbor agreement or a good neighbor policy. And you think that the recommendations we are making here today might seem a lot. They're very short-listed compared to what you will see leasers sign with their housing provider. Whether it's a large apartment complex or whatever, I have not seen anything that's short.
Mhm. Okay. Right. And yeah, we do still need, as that, like Debbie mentioned, we need to clarify that a business license is even something that would be required for this. So, but I do understand the venue for it. We've actually, so this is kind of the bounds for the operator agreement. Um, we've kind of walked through all this, sets, a lot of activities. The operator agreement we provided really is an example. I think we can make a requirement that an operator have an agreement and then offer the agreement that we've drafted as an example. But just like the number of the folks who came for our the panel discussion that we had, they have their own operator agreements that they use, and those, as long as the city said, okay, yeah, they meet, they have these certain things, uh, it's good, it's fine to be able to use your own as well, as long as it includes certain minimum requirements, minimum criteria in them. So I think
Yeah,
we'll have
just
to find a way to include that in the code and figure out how that be a requirement.
and a point of information here, the permitting, panhandling, you can't, I mean, why we absolutely like to see that in a residential agreement. Code-wise, the city of Kenmore does not have a panhandling code prohibition. In fact, our surrounding cities do, and when there's contact with a panhandler, they usually move downstream or upstream to Kenmore so that they can panhandle in Kenmore. They are Our social workers and our police offer resources uh, and opportunities to move along. But we don't have a panhandling ordinance in Kenmore, and I just have to point that out.
Is there a
Okay.
reason not to provide like minimum, whatever the minimum standards of the operator agreement are in the municipal code? Just to say, this is the very basic of what we are going to
Right,
require.
almost like some of the bullet points here of saying you have to place
Yeah,
limitations on certain things, you have to define a geographic area, you have to do these different, I don't,
yeah.
I think that's where our mind is going in terms of the recommendation is, yeah, there's something in the code that outlines what needs to be included in an operator agreement.
Well, and I think what Karina said, my question as we were talking about this is kind of like, well, what in this operator agreement where you provided the draft, like what of this is already somewhere else in the municipal code? Like, is there a requirement that we keep our streets clean outside of our businesses and, or do any of these other things, right? Is that embedded somewhere else so that if the operator didn't do these things, that's a code violation of somewhere in our municipal code that somebody just has to find? Um, or are these new additions that are specific only to staff housing providers?
I was
They're in
thinking
the code.
similar, I was thinking similarly, on, do we have similar guidelines for any other large housing development that's built? I mean, about littering and garbage and public nuisance and illegal acts and et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I understand why we are focusing so much on the vulnerable demographics that live here, for some of these things, but I also just want I want as many parts of this to look streamlined as across Kenmore as possible. And some of these things, I don't think any of us want in any of our neighborhoods for any development. So
I think
also, planning commission, do you want to
We
put
can just put
a,
them in there.
right?
I think the
That do
current,
not for any,
yeah,
right?
sorry, not to cut you off, but I think currently, right, the place that exists is in a private lease agreement, and that is where it would have to be, right? And I think to Karina's point, like those are fairly lengthy, and I'm sure most of them probably say, hey, we have these rules that you are agreeing to follow when you lease from our building. And if you don't follow those, you will be kicked out. So I think most, I think anyone who has makes you sign a legal lease probably has some level of that, but they probably do vary. And I don't think it's a city requirement, right? It's more of like it's a private requirement to have a lease.
I don't know about that because um, city-wise, when the city is working with business partners and agreements, um, the agreements include ways to ensure that we have a nice, clean community. And so, keeping your property maintained and safe and operating can be free of, litter and garbage and um, obstructions and you know graffiti even, um, and there's a way to hold those businesses accountable, and they do, um, and we have amazing business partners and operators in Kenmore who are wonderful, and so it's rarely that those levers have to be pulled, because we have such great business partners, but you always have to plan for the just in
Yeah. And I think again,
case
we're
scenario.
talking,
So I think we
agreed.
have
I
to
think we're
set our
talking
ground.
businesses.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead. Businesses
yeah,
versus say residential development. So
yeah.
Just from all the residential leases I've done, and granted, I haven't managed an extremely large development. A lot of the stuff that's in the operator good neighbor policy is, yes, sort of included in a standard lease agreement. It's not spelled out the same way it is here.
mhm.
But it's also, it's also not in any way, shape, or form like enforceable by your neighbors. Like the drug house that, that was across the street from ours for years was, I'm sure, a rental. You call the police or do whatever, but
Yeah.
you have limited recourse as the neighbor, and often that's just to call the landlord and hope that they are compassionate and want to do something about it. Um, but I guess I don't think that, well, just call the landlord will meet the community's like level of concern about what impact step developments would have on the surrounding area.
Right.
So as much as I would like to say, like, we're all adults, we can just be responsible and conscientious of our neighbors and take care of the community that we live in. I think sometimes it's hard for people to trust that other people will do that. And that's why I'm feeling like, this needs to be in the code in some way, enforceable in some
The
way.
the minimum requirements for it, and then
Yeah,
The city of Shoreline requires, and it's in their code, that they require adherence to the Good Neighbor Plan and addresses how the shelter will operate, address
Mhm.
litter, noise, security procedures, and other issues that may be of concern to the surrounding community, a criteria in which and when to discontinue the shelter, for example, violations of the operational agreements, and they also they adapted from an interlocal agreement to a memorandum, uh, because code changes often and frequently with King County, and for housing operators to seek funding, your local code has to be in compliance with um, King County funding, King County to be able to seek their grants. So they also included a memorandum to for minor um, wordsmithing and edits and number changes to match King County, and they authorized the city clerk and the city attorney and executive to make those really minor edits so that there's cohesion there. They also required that, and Bellevue does also, that operators seek grant funding um, because the municipality is not responsible for funding the housing. Um, there's housing funds that are kind of slipping away, especially under the current administration. And these were stopgaps that they put in place so that they're protecting financial outcomes of the city. They also put in place a number of fire and EMS response that would be allowable, and beyond that threshold is the operator's duty to cover. And so it just creates for a good financial agreement and safety plan, security plan for the city, and for a good partnership with the operator.
And so these are everything that Karina just talked about are things that we've sort of talked around in the past a little bit. Um, there's certainly things we could add in to the proposed code language. At some point, right, I think the discussion we had previously was, are we, is this overly burdensome? Are we treating this too differently from your typical housing? Is this no longer a streamlined process that we heard in the community comments that many people feel like this should be very streamlined, very straightforward, very quick. So again, not advocating one way or the other, just putting forward that in the past we've had discussions about trying to make this as seamless of a process as possible.
There are differences. There are difference in housing that's, business residential housing, business operators that provide large amount of rental property versus step housing. Um, they require different funding sources and revenue patterns. And when some of those are shrinking away, not just the state, but the federal operators are also looking at how do you encourage that financial hardship piece and reducing that threshold. And for the most part, the business partners that cities choose to operate with and partner with already have good fundraising sources and are not all reliant on a municipality for funding. So what happens is when the funding passes through or falls through, who's on the hook and who's on the line is part of this conversation, is also part of a large conversation that happens within our community. It's a responsible conversation. Municipal leaders that are highly, uh, respected also see that this is an important discussion, and it's a discussion that's happening across the state. So I think it's fair to say that step housing is slightly different than all other forms of housing. It has a higher level of need. There's no argument among that in federal government or state government and the legislature. We see that regionally, and we see that locally in our municipalities. So again, I think we're talking about doing all the best and serving people's needs. We know people need housing. This is critical, and we're being responsive of that, but we're also being responsible of our financial budget, and we're being responsible with our business operators, and working on creating a healthy community that works together. And none of that is less than, evident here.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Is the group in agreement generally with what Karina mentioned?
Yeah, I think, we are treating stuff differently. I don't think that the operator agreement or the good neighbor agreement are creating, I guess what I'm trying to be mindful of is creating an insurmountable or an undue financial burden on the provider. I think these are relatively minor in the overall scheme of what's required to create a step development, and where I want to be mindful of not treating step housing differently. I'm not the community, and what I would like to see is step being built. And if we don't put boundaries and guidelines in that work for the community, it will not be built. I mean, we're trying to figure out what works for housing providers and what works for Kenmore. And if we're able to do that, then we might get it. And if we can't, then we're gonna be right here again every time we have this discussion. They're gonna just jam more bills down on our throat from the state level. So like, we either do this responsibly, and in a way that actually can encourage this kind of development and say, here, we are trying to support, and I do feel like we are trying. But we're also trying to listen to the community and be mindful of what their feedback is so that we don't get an angry pitchfork mob. We don't really want that either.
Yeah, it is a great point. And I'm glad that you put it the way you did, that, right, this is, just like Karina said, there are differences between residential housing and step housing, but these are not insurmountable requirements to place on a development. And they are something that would go a long way towards garnering community support for these types of projects. So I think it's a great way to put it.
And the last thing there is that, like Shoreline and Bellevue, they both have college campuses. The Shoreline specifically entered into part of their recommendations is that this campus housing is included in their definitions. Because there is a clear line of poverty with people who are seeking a higher education. We do have a university that's in our borders. We can't, ignore that. We have seen publishing and news and articles that Bastyr is considering other housing opportunities for their campus site. And I believe that we should be considering part of that outlined area for step housing, which hasn't been discussed in this committee at all or presented to this committee, but it makes logical and reasonable sense to consider that.
One thing that I'd say that Shoreline College should really, Shoreline did with their step, is because Shoreline College, is piloting their homeless support program as part of their college. And so the college partnering with the city for their step recommendations, like that was a really holistic view that made sense. Having their campus be involved as a resource and a hotspot and cater to, unhoused students and be advocating for step housing. Like that's a really great partnership that's happening there. And so I think that makes a lot of sense for why they're doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's also why we've seen some hinting from Bastyr University with part of their educational component, and also their desire to expand types of housing offerings within their their borders. However, I think there was so much discussion about downtown housing. The funding streams connect to major routes of bus travel, and Bastyr is within one of those routes. It makes sense to conclude that a map region around that, and I would recommend that back to the planning commission or back to council as well.
Just so I'm clear, that you recommend that the Bastyr be included in one of the areas where and I can't remember the map to say whether it is or isn't and how Bastyr is zoned, but that it be an area that allows permanent supportive housing. Is that what you're saying?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
There
Just want to make
also
sure.
a site that has a lot of education around environmental and social justice, housing, psychology, and behavioral and social health. And so those are parameters in which match the needs of community as it is now. So it makes sense and it's logical to consider that as a geographic mapped area for consideration. It's a campus, it's a college campus. Most colleges and campuses that have housing include some sort of low income housing and even in this case, we're expanding code for step housing. It makes sense to include this as a carve out. And I would be interested to hear what our other committee members think about that.
The zoning for Bastyr is public, semi-public place, so there's like a very narrow type of thing that could be put on that land, like, I think the building we're sitting in currently is PSP zoned. I think our future public works is PSP zoned, so there has to be, with Bastyr, my understanding is that they get housing as an ancillary use to the educational component. Where it couldn't be done with housing in itself. I mean, I could see that if it is student housing for extremely low income students, that might work, but this all would have to go through their master plan update. This isn't something that's an
They
easy
would have to initiate that,
little
right?
tweak, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is complicated.
Oh, absolutely. I agree. The master plan is being currently discussed, and so it makes sense to include discussions.
Right. It could be a consideration that goes to council from this group. It's not to say that this code update that we're going to do directly relating to the edits that we made is going to do that, but it could be something that this group, if they decided to, could put forward that council could think about as part of a larger effort. So.
Can I ask a couple of quick questions just so that I know I'm not losing my mind? Are there churches in Kenmore that are in the R zones that are not like?
Yeah, I asked about this the other time and you were gonna come back to us, Nick. Thank you for bringing this up.
I have notes.
Yes.
I may have not gone back to this. Your question was, are there churches that are in residential zones that are zoned fully zoned residential?
Yeah, that are zoned residential that are now gonna be allowed for transitional and PSH, but I kind of think that we should let the churches in the R zones have a shelter permit too. I don't think that's gonna freak anybody out.
There are churches that operate in residential zone,
Yeah.
and they also have different protections under state and federal law of being able to build and provide sanctuary. But most operate in a healthy working relationship with the city. And so I know that, for example, North Lake Lutheran Church has been working on amending their land covenant. They have an issue with a covenant that's making it really hard to build affordable housing on the property. And they've been working with the city and the county with that for quite a while.
But I think, Nick, the question is for churches, is this kind of housing allowed on that property based on the zoning, correct?
Well, if they're in the R zones, the new overlay.
Yeah.
Transitional and PSH, but I would like to just add shelters to churches.
Any faith, place of worship, let them clothe,
Yeah.
feed the hungry, do the thing.
Okay.
And just
Yeah, we
Shelter,
just to make it so they don't get messed with,
yes,
just
a lot of them have ample parking.
right.
Let
yeah,
them.
it should be a fairly, I mean, I'm thinking even
Yeah,
yeah, it should be a fairly straightforward thing. I'm thinking even there's a church near me, and I'm again Northeast Seattle, so down the road a little bit, but that during the summer regularly um, has a temporary emergency housing in their parking lot. So it's not all year round, it's seasonal, but um, yeah, I think it's something that we can definitely take a look at. And yeah, it's more that churches operate in mostly every zone. There's not there, because of religious freedoms. There's a lot of areas that churches can operate. But yeah, by virtue of it being in a residential zone, it would be allowed to do permanent supportive and transition, and we just have to add emergency housing to it because right now emergency housing is just where hotels are permitted, but we could add churches to that as well.
and I would say also to get nitpicky, because sometimes some churches operate shelter as part of like a ministry rather than their own
Like
separate
license.
shelter. That changes like their ADA needs, right? Like think of, I'm not gonna start name dropping things, but if a church operates something, they're like, oh, this is our ministry. People can come in and people can sleep and we will feed you. Versus if we are doing something completely separate from our church ministry and we're calling it shelter, that means that you actually have to do like ADA accommodations for a shelter. And that is a
Mhm.
higher standard of taking care of the vulnerable than if they're simply calling it their church ministry, right? And I'm saying that both are, I'm not punching down on anything, but sometimes there are elderly people put in bunk beds or in situations that are not up to like shelter ADA code because religious ADA standards are different than like shelters. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
So churches doing housing ministry is even technically by code, not the same experience with the same ADA protections as
Mhm.
someone doing a shelter. So that is why I just want to say, and again, I'm not punching down on anyone. I want us to all be doing our best and they can still choose to do however they're going to do it. But I want any church who says, I want to do the full thing, I want to call it a shelter, I want to do top tier, I want to have the best ADA protections, I want to do da 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 da. I want that to be as easy for the places of worship as possible. I don't want them to say that's not allowed. I have to call it a ministry. I have to call it something else. It's a
Mhm.
back-ended way to help their neighbors.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I
Understood.
absolutely understand that, and also, um, there are U.S. Supreme Court rulings that have protected the difference actions of, churches offering ministry, um, and you know, policy zoning government is separate from church and state, right? That code language and pre-directions set, and the religious partners of this in the state highly protect that, and and are comfortable suing back when um, trespassing upon their religious rights to operate uh, religious ministry in housing and in what they provide. However, within our borders, we have really great religious partners that operate really nicely with the city and work with the city to ensure that they're providing healthy, safe um, operating places. North Lake Lutheran, for example, has an industrial kitchen. They have ADA accessibility. Many of our churches do in Kenmore. So there's just those differences, and I want to make sure we're being mindful of that, because as much as we want to desire to be able to have policy that's really broad reaching, there are also limits to what the U.S. Supreme Court has already defined and says
Well,
that we can provide code to.
I guess I'll just say I think we're we're not talking about limiting anything that currently exists. It's adding the ability to do something additional, is what I'm hearing. So, um, okay,
Few more questions.
yeah, go ahead.
I don't know if we talked, I think we talked about it, but at one point I had asked about parking reduction tools for step housing because and this kind of goes back to the, neighborhood corner stores and
Hmm.
businesses. But one of the things that we heard from the providers that we talked to is a lot of people that are utilizing step are not people who have cars. And so why are we holding these to the same parking standards that, we would hold a normal residential property to? So is that something that, I did not see it in the code updates, I could have missed it.
It's not something currently in there right now. It is certainly something we could add if this group would like to add a either parking reduction or parking elimination. I mean, we just went through middle housing where if you're within a certain distance of a major transit stop, the parking requirements are different from a typical, housing project. So there could be parameters that just flat out apply to step housing or apply within, you could take a similar path of within a certain distance. It's not the same logic that you just laid out of really the user being different and not requiring a car, not typically having a car.
Well,
Uh,
for the residential right now, it would just fall under like our basic codes, right? Which are being
it would
reduced.
fall under the same parking requirements of a residential
I
building.
think like the biggest issues are like when we had Plymouth with 100+ people and 2 parking spots or whatever. Like,
But yeah,
11.
it wasn't a lot.
I mean, like that we can't do that, right? So
Right.
I would rather see this just the parking restrictions are going to come down organically with the code updates that are rolling through right now.
I think the reduction on Plymouth was something like a, like 80% reduction from what was required from code. I mean, it was hugely different from what the code requirements were. And I think, a 50% reduction might be appropriate or something like that, or I mean, even a 25%, but I think we do need to consider that, yeah, I mean, also from an environmental standpoint, like, do you really want people making more impervious surface or parking spots for people that are not going to use them? Like, it doesn't make sense for the provider to have to dedicate all this space to parking if the people that are gonna be living there are just not gonna use it.
Well, and money, you talked about wanting to be efficient with provider money, like parking spaces and housing are tens of thousands of dollars per space. People think of them as blank space. I was like, oh, it's just parking, but no, they are tens of thousands of dollars per space. And so, I mean, I think a lot of people are spooked by the Plymouth example because it was going to be so big and centralized and so many parking, but that's a really singular extreme example that I don't think is anyone wants to duplicate.
I think we could outline findings that say if you are right, because we talked in the past, there's so many different types of permanent supportive housing. Some are going to require cars, right? Some could be for large families or it depends. So there could be some that require a car to the same extent that a normal development would be, and then there are probably a lot of them that would not require the same level of car usage um, that a typical housing project would have. So there could be the ability to easily do, we'll say like a variance or an exception or similar to what Plymouth went through of having a way to be able to reduce down to a certain percentage, like you're talking about, Caitlin, if certain findings are made, right? If you're a certain type of housing and then the community development director determines that, yes, we think this type of housing doesn't require as many cars as part of the director decision on the project, it could be a director approval of that exception or that variance to the parking standard.
I can support a reduction in parking spaces. When you look at a city, Bellevue, there's a couple large step housing locations that have 50 plus or 100 housing units, and at those sites you see at the just about 50 plus you see 10 spots. I think at the Plymouth sites, I think there are about 20 parking spots. I like to see a reduction along with the provider providing a community car for assisting the residents to appointments. both the city of Bellevue did that and city of
Mhm.
Shoreline did that. City of Redmond is including that. And they're just getting up and going, the city of Redmond. But both city of Bellevue and the city of Shoreline also included that you can't, have junk vehicles, abandoned junk vehicles, that are inoperable and unmovable. We don't have anything like that in our current code. I do recommend that. And it's good for the environment and it's good for the community, um, in our managing our community. So I would like to see a no junk or abandoned vehicle provision being part of the Good Neighbor Agreement as well.
Okay. Caitlin, any other questions on your side?
I just
Yeah,
wanted
sure.
to double check that, any sort of step housing construction would be exempt from the fee in lieu requirements that were just put in for Arch when we did middle housing.
That's not I don't think that's a stipulation that's currently in there.
But
Well,
it isn't
obviously, that's not defined. Yeah, Debbie, we would have to talk about the
Yeah, we
best
need
way
to,
to do that.
yeah, because
Because
there are
technically,
some
this all generally qualifies as
affordable
affordable
housing.
units, so you would be providing the
Yeah.
units rather than not having to pay the in lieu.
Paying the service, so we would have to.
Right.
Fee, right?
But the fee and lieu requirements are on a size threshold now. Unit size threshold, and I don't think that we'd hit that size threshold, but I don't know for sure. So I'm not talking about the mandatory housing, like for the higher density zones, but the R zones, when we did middle housing, now have that $6 a square foot for anything over 1,750 square feet. RHP on it, correct? Council did that like 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Debbie, I haven't followed the most recent.
I'm trying to keep my brain open.
I
I think we need to kind of look at that. So what you're talking about is the fee and the requirement for affordable housing, but if this is essentially an affordable housing, that seems like odd to say that you
Yes,
have to pay it, but you're affordable housing. So I think we just need to check the language and
yeah,
see.
I think what I'm asking for not
Yeah.
is clarification that it wouldn't apply, but clarification that the code isn't written in such a way that it would mistakenly be applied in this. Because
I don't.
yeah, with
Sorry, I
middle
was gonna
housing,
say.
some overlap of like the mandatory affordable units and also the fee in lieu. And so I want to make sure that all of these pieces are working together in a way that doesn't tag this with an additional like fee for affordable housing anywhere in the city.
It's a good question. I think because you are building the affordable units, the fee in lieu would not be applicable, but we'll double check to make sure that that is how it would be interpreted. That's my thought right off the bat.
Would be my thought too. I'm just asking for a.
Right. Yep.
just a-
No, it's a good point. Yeah.
It's a good loop to close. Good loop
Yep.
to close.
Just
Okay, we've answered all the questions that I had on here. We have answered all of them throughout this discussion, which is great. Really, after that, we've talked about this November 17th meeting, that being the next step. There are a couple steps in between that, especially knowing that we didn't have our full committee today. We will go through, and I'll say, because we have a timeline, right? I'll say within the next 2 weeks, we will get you all drafts so that you have the ability to make some comments prior to going to that initial council meeting. Debbie, can you specify that initial council meeting on the 17th? The goal of that is just to present findings. It is not for any action or anything like that. Is that the case?
That's the case. So this is basically providing the committee's recommendations, and then council then will take those recommendations and decide what to do with them. Ultimately getting to an ordinance, but to get to adopting an ordinance is likely going to be into 2026.
Yeah.
Because procedurally, we've got to draft an ordinance, give the Department of Commerce notice, do the environmental process, hold a public hearing, that's.
Oh, goody.
fun time.
Yes,
So
there will need to be a public hearing on this eventually.
if you're only giving the recommendation on the 17th, I can't make it happen before the end of the
Yeah.
year. The last council meeting is December 8th, so there's just not enough time to meet all the procedural things we have to do to get to an ordinance. So the adoption then will probably be in, I'd say, the first quarter of 26.
Is
Okay.
this one of the things where a model ordinance gets applied on the 1st of January if we don't adopt our own or
No.
no? Or-
So Nick, what I don't know if I can pull it up quickly enough now, I will send you a separate email and just kind of let you know the timing where we need the final stuff to be ready to go through the council agenda approval process.
Yep.
Because that's usually 2 weeks prior to the meeting, so I want to make sure that if we're giving the committee time, it's not like unlimited time. Because then you will need to provide any comments and then those will need to either be
Yeah.
considered amendments, so it's not going to be endless time for comments, but I think we've
No,
heard
it's about a
good
week.
feedback. Yes, about a week,
Yeah.
So,
But it's just, again, it's one more chance for this committee to be able to just look at the materials and make sure we capture things right. Because we've talked about things tonight that we talked about in the past that we didn't catch in the draft. So we want to make sure that this group has a chance to be able to look at it one more time. So I did want to, Karina, we'll get to it in just a second. I did want to ask, I mean, for that meeting on the 17th, Debbie, is the expectation that the committee members, if they can make it, will attend and give some portion of a presentation, or is it that staff and our team will give the presentation on behalf of the committee?
and I'm thinking this will be something like we do when the planning commission gives a recommendation, is that the staff would kind of give an overview of the process, would kind of outline what the changes are. And then could turn to the committee to either speak to, certain aspects of that they've either been interested in or have had, you know, so they can each speak to something. So
Yes.
typically then we get through, the staff presentation, I'm saying in like 10 minutes, and then we can maybe have another 10-15 minutes of the committee kind of giving their perspectives on the changes. And then it will be open for council comments and questions. That's how I kind of envisage it going.
Okay. So we'll outline all that in email so the entire committee, whoever wants to attend, knows that you have a couple minutes to highlight the things that are most important to you. And then if additional things come up in council discussion, feel free to have a back and forth and get further into certain topics that are important. But we'll set the baseline of us giving the presentation up front to set the stage. And then, I think it's definitely, I'm sure council and the whole intent with setting up the committee is they want to hear from the committee. So. Okay. Karina, do you have any last thoughts?
I have two last thoughts I really want to settle in with the committee is that City of Shoreline adopted a proactive code enforcement policy. And in that includes code deviations, violations, and reporting. This was also to support the benefit of affordable housing and step housing and that work. It's simple, clean, and defined. I know that prior Mayor Herbeck had also recommended Kenmore consider adopting that. It would also feed into and support the clean line of what we've been discussing throughout our meetings. And on a second point, I think it's important and fair to say why our committee has worked together really beautifully and it has been in a majority of an agreement. There are things that could have benefited the process along the way. The open house meeting for step housing occurred on a night of major conflict within our residential borders. And that was on the same night as North Shore School District's open house orientation that parents and guardians go to support their families in education. And that makes it really hard to participate in a committee meeting where we're providing, seeking feedback. And it was only held one day. And why many of us had brought this to the attention of Ms. Bent, and we were pointed to the fact that there's an open survey. It has been longstanding and understood in Kenmore that to provide equitable community feedback, you need to provide several opportunities, dates and times that differentiate to help seek that community feedback. I'd recommend one more meeting for our community, maybe held on a weekend, so that community can participate and provide feedback. And amongst recommendations made by our committee and in conversations, we didn't have many comparison documents. For example, on good neighbor plans, policies, or agreements. It was very much free-flowing discussion, and what some of us had to research on our own. So that's important feedback for the benefit of any discussion moving forward and for the future of other committees that form. And I thank you for being part of the process and having me be part of this process with you. It's been good working with all of you.
Thank you. I will echo that. It's been great working with this committee. I really appreciate the time. We're now an hour and a half, 45 minutes past when we said we were going to end. So it just shows the dedication this group has. And so really appreciate you all taking the time and look forward to providing the materials and then making a recommendation with you all to council. So with that, thank you all and have a great night.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Okay.